All right, joining me for a special episode of the channel is my longtime dear friend, Kevin Maurer. Here's a picture of Kevin and I in Hollywood back in the day. I think this is 2015, 2016. For people savvy with Hollywood, this is Cahuenga and Hollywood Boulevard, where the first headquarters of the startup website We Are the Mighty was back in those days. If you look closely over Kevin's left shoulder, you can see the Hollywood sign. So Kevin's body of work is well known. Some folks may know he's the co-writer of No Easy Day. And then most recently, he was the guy who provided entree for me to Lucky Luckadoo, the B-17 pilot whose episode was wildly popular. And Kevin, that's a story I like to tell people because you're like, hey, this guy Lucky, he's pretty cool. You might want to talk to him. And I'm like, well, so you'll be there on the episode, right? You're like, no, you don't need me. I'm like, he's 100 years old. And you're like, no, he's great. And in fact, as viewers, the 1 million plus viewers have seen, he is amazing. So is he still around? Do we know?
Yeah, he's still doing speaking. He still does Zooms. He Zooms into classes. The guy's a marvel. Yeah.
So I was doing research for my first of the two recent Syria episodes, the longer form one where HTS had just rolled into Damascus. And I had remembered that one of my guests, who digital combat simulator players will recognize, Casmo, who is very well known in that gaming community for how he flies the Apache, but he's also a real life Apache pilot. So I had him on the channel to talk about his time flying the Apache. And he mentioned kind of in passing that he was serving in Syria in 2018 when they had this incident. And the quote he said after the incident was, "Did we just start World War III?" And so I didn't think anything else of it. It's not very well publicized or little known. But as I'm doing the research for that episode, I came across your article back in 2023 at the Warhorse. So I was like, hey, Kevin, can you come on and talk about this particular incident? So let's go back to February of 2018 and take us through what happened that day in Syria.
February 18 is where the actual battle occurs, and it's essentially the first time the U.S. and Russians, actually get into a firefight. It's the Wagner Group and the Assad's forces against the Syrian Democratic Forces, and basically they surround a Tier 1 Delta team that was doing a mission, and an SF team backed up by some Marines from 5th Group go in as a QRF, and they hold the line with their 50 cals and their MRAPs while they get attacked by Russian tanks. I mean, it's straight out of like Clancy's, Red Storm Rising. I mean, it's Russian tanks rushing at American troops, light troops.
Where were they particularly? Did they know that Wagner was nearby? Had there been previous threats to them? What was their mission? Walk us through some of the granular details of the situation.
I told the story from three of the members of the QRF. They were from the 5th Special Forces Group, and they'd been there for months fighting ISIS, and they'd been going, they've been running up and south of Raqqa, and they've been stacking bodies. I mean, they were doing a body count. It was part of how they were trying to measure the success of the mission. But these guys talk about they were killing ISIS fighters every day, and the mission was slowly climbing closer to Raqqa and was moving north, where Delta was also heavily operating during that time, and they had set up at this gas oil refinery. It's called the Conico yard. They had set up a mission there, and they were operating out of this hard structures there. At the time, though, there'd been this ongoing tension between Wagner and the Americans, and the Russians were actually, if the Euphrates sort of cuts right through the middle, and on the western bank of the Euphrates were the Russians, and on the eastern bank were the Americans. And the SF guys would tell me stories where they'd catch ISIS fighters between them, and the Russians would fire across the river at the ISIS fighters. But the Russians had been getting aggressive. You've seen the videos where they smash vehicles together.
I used some of that B-roll in the Syrian episode that I did earlier this week.
So there was an ongoing tension, but what happened was some Russian and Syrian forces were getting squirrely. Basically, they were starting to surround the Conico plant. They were going through battle drills. The U.S. SF team was in as a base nearby. They were watching the Russians get ready. And there's a great scene in the story where the battle captains are like, "Hey, I think they're getting ready to attack. Like they've watched them do the battle drill enough." And so essentially what happens is the Wagner Group guys with the Syrians make a run at the Americans, and it's a small SF or a small Delta team with some Indage, some partner forces. I think the biggest thing they probably had was a 240. Machine guns, really light, and so the Russians attack with about 27 vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and they make a run at this Conico plant. So when the attack starts, they use artillery. I mean, it's combined arms. Like World War II, let's run the tanks at them.
So how many guys versus how many guys roughly? How many Wagner dudes versus how many of our guys at the Conico plant?
About 500 pro-Syrian against 40 Americans.
Wow. This is the freaking Alamo.
Yeah, so they're stacked in the Alamo. The QRF call goes out. The Kurdish fighters that are working with Fifth Special Forces groups leads them. Blacked out trucks all the way to the Conico plant, and the SF team describes when they get there, the tracer rounds, artillery rounds, the whole lot. It's like they described it as a fireworks display, like watching fireworks on 4th of July, and they were sweating it. Like it's rare you can get Special Forces guys to admit they were scared. They were scared going into this because this was artillery and tanks. This wasn't ISIS. This wasn't spray and pray AK-47s and RPGs. This was armored personnel carriers, armored tanks, battle tanks with 125 millimeter, main gun against MRAPs and 50 cals.
So the Wagner guys knew that they were shooting at Americans. It wasn't like mistaken identity. They thought it was an SDF unit. They knew that this was, mano a mano Wagner versus U.S. forces. Yes,
because I was told that the Pentagon was calling the Russians and they were trying to deconflict this thing as fast as they could. And so while the QRF is headed there in their MRAPs, your buddy and the Apaches are starting to spin up, and they start to call in airstrikes.
So before the air support shows up, have there been any casualties on the American side? Has anybody got hit by this fusillade coming at them?
No, because my understanding is the Delta team with the Kurdish fighters just dug in and hunkered down. So they were pretty dug in and protected against the artillery barrage, and then the MRAPs were able to withstand shrapnel. So as the QRF rolls in, the Delta guys are shocked to see them. They line them up on the berm, the MRAPs in a line on the berm, and they watch the Russians basically close from their starting positions towards the defensive line. And the SF guys talked at length about seeing, the Syrian and Wagner Group fighters on foot, moving out of the APCs, coming towards the battle line and just destroying them with a 50 cal. And that's when the tanks show up.
So these are Syrian army tanks, which are Soviet, are they T-72s? These are formidable tanks.
10 Russian tanks make it onto the battlefield, and they're moving in a line towards the Conico site, towards the battle line. They can't see very well because they don't have night vision. They're missing. The U.S. guys at that point are hammering them with 50 cal. It's not doing anything, but they're marking targets. At that point, though, Chauncey, who's the team sergeant, they decide they're going to stay. Because they know, though, if the Apaches don't get there in time, that there's no stopping the tanks. At some point, they're just going to roll right over them, right? And they can't stop them. But they decide they're not going to move the MRAPs. They're going to hold the line, and they're going to continue to fire. So basically, the Russians got to about 1,000 meters before the U.S. guys opened up. And what the Special Forces guys realized very quickly was the Russians didn't, nor the Syrians had night vision. And so they couldn't get a good beat on the American trucks. So they were missing wildly. The tanks were missing wildly. But the U.S. guys, because of their systems, were able to zero in on the tank.
So how much time had passed from first contact until the air assets showed up?
I believe it comes maybe an hour or two into the battle.
So the pucker factor is high for a couple of hours, is basically what you're saying.
The team sergeant, before they left to go on this mission, because they knew what they were facing, went into the team and said, if you don't want to do this one, you don't have to go. They had a good idea that if going into this mission against tanks, that they were going to be outgunned.
This is one of those, not quite a suicide mission, but the odds are not in our favor.
So when they get the call to go on the QRF, the team gets together around the trucks, and the team sergeant says, "Hey, if you don't want to go on this, you don't have to go," because he knew that this was a suicide. It wasn't a suicide mission, but this was one of those missions where you're completely outgunned, and you're going to need things to fall in place, and you're going to need the air cover to save you, unlike what they'd been fighting with the ISIS guys.
Well, this is the beauty of these guys. I mean, I think I'd be loyal to a squadron mate or whatever, but maybe it's more acute in special ops and tier one. Just like Black Hawk Down, you saw the same thing with a QRF, knowing full well that you were outgunned and you were walking into a very kinetic, to put it mildly, circumstance. So that's the same drill here, it seems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, all war boils down to the guy to your left and right. And so it was just, they knew, all the politics was gone. They knew that if they were in trouble, they would hope someone was coming for them, and they were going to do the same. I just saw a note. I want to make this note. We were talking about when the air cover comes. One of the things that slowed the air was that there were surface-to-air systems in the area, and that they had to deconflict. And U.S. officials, according to my sources, contacted the Russians, and who initially denied that the Russian forces were even part of this. And then eventually the Russian officials prevented the Wagner Group from using air support or the air systems. And once the air systems were not going to be online, the air cover came in, and that's when they turned the tide.
So this negotiation is going on behind the scenes, which seems kind of surreal, right? That Americans are negotiating with Russians, and Russians, as you said, are kind of in a little bit of denial. Obviously, Wagner has a special status as a mercenary group. These are not, nation state warfighters. This is a third party at some level. Never mind, they're all Russian nationals that man Wagner, as we know very well from what was publicized about their involvement in Ukraine, including the fall of their leader, Prigozhin. So they show up, the air assets show up. Now the SF guys are doing the forward air controller thing for Apaches and also Strike Eagles. I understand we're also in the complement of air assets.
Yeah, and they had RPAs as well. The drones were there as well.
I'm guessing they made short work of the threat.
As soon as the Apaches came on, the U.S. Special Forces guys had marked all the targets, and so it was a shooting gallery at that point, without any threat of getting shot down. They were burning through ammo. At one point in the story, Josh, one of the team guys, has to get up on top of the MRAP and reload the 50 cal. And he's up there with a red light. And that's what he took fire, because they could see the red light. But otherwise, they couldn't really see anything without night vision. So the lack of night fighting hurt them terribly. And for about 45 minutes, the Apaches circle, and they basically hammer them with chain guns and rockets, and what you're saying, and it destroys all the tanks except for one. One of them, I think, gets off the battlefield because the team later, and it didn't make it in the story I wrote, but later they have to track that tank down. It sneaks back across the Euphrates, and they track it all down and find it and destroy it.
With their tanks gone, they obviously lose the advantage. They don't have NVGs, they don't have tank, they don't have armor now. So are the Americans just picking them off left and right at that point, or do they retreat? What happened?
So around dawn, they disengage. There's a ceasefire. There's an initial radio call that's put out right after the ceasefire that a Russian bomber is inbound, and so there's a pucker factors back as they hunker down in those MRAPs, thinking that they're about to get bombed by a Russian bomber. It ends up. They ends up withdrawing, or didn't exist. I don't know if it was rumant or what, but there was, for a second there, the guys believed they were going to get a Russian bomber. And then at that point around dawn, the ceasefire holds, and they're able to clear the field. At that point, the Russians retreat about an hour before dawn after the ceasefire. U.S. guys do a battle assessment. They say they fired between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds of 50 cal over that night, and the estimated casualties 300 Russian and pro-Syrian, and then let's see, about 5 Russian citizens confirmed out of that battle, out of those 300, and 1 local Kurdish soldier was wounded. No American casualties whatsoever, and 9 out of the 10 tanks were hit.
So what were the consequences on the international front, on the State Department front? I mean, here American forces killed Russian nationals. Was that dismissed under the auspices that they were mercenaries?
Yep. Yeah, everybody just looked away. Like we all pretended that the Wagner Group operated like Blackwater, that they were independent of Russian policy.
And was that the claim by the Russians themselves? Like, we don't control those guys, so please don't blame us for them attacking you?
They hung the Wagner guys out to dry. I mean, that's where that really famous piece of audio with the Wagner commander talking about after the battle on the radio, and he says, to make it short, we've had our fucking asses kicked. They tore us to pieces. They beat our asses like we are little pieces of shit. That's like the best quote ever to a battle assessment by your enemy.
We actually have that audio, Kevin, so let me play it now.
Вот то, что новости показывают, да, там по телевизору, что там, ну, в Сирии там 25 человек там раненых, там, сирийской, там, блядь, армии, там, ну и так далее. Короче, это нахуй разъебали наших. Вот, короче, в одной роте нахуй 200 человек, нахуй 200-х, сразу же. В другой 10 человек. И вот про третью не знаю, но там тоже растрепали очень сильно вообще. Вот, короче, 3 роты пострадало. Вот, били пиндосы. Сначала артой накрыли, нахуй, вот, а потом подняли, нахуй, 4 вертушки. И в карусель запустили, короче, из крупнокалиберных пулеметов, нахуй, короче, всех хуячили. У наших, кроме автоматов, нахуй, не было вообще ничего. Вот, ну уж не говоря там о каком-то ПЗРК и так далее. Короче, растрепали там вообще, ну, устроили ад. И пиндосы конкретно и четко знали, нахуй, что это мы идем русские. Вот. Наши шли завод отжимать, а они на этом заводе, короче, сидели. Короче, мы пизды получили вообще жестких, нахуй. И вот сейчас мне пацаны отзвонились, нахуй, там сидят, бухают. Короче, блядь, много очень, нахуй, пропавших без вести. Ну, это, короче, пиздец вообще там. Блядь, еще одно унижение, блядь, и, ну, короче, с нами, нахуй, ну, никто вообще, нахуй, не считается. Как с чертями поступили вообще. Думаю, что наши заднюю сейчас рубят, нахуй, наше правительство, и никто ничего, никакую ответку, никто ничего не сделает, и никто никого не уничтожит за это, нахуй. Вот такие вот у нас потери.
So what's the after action here? Did we reinforce the Conico outpost? Did we go somewhere else to avoid these kind of entanglements? Because I think the nature of our presence in eastern Syria ebbs and flows with the availability of host nations to allow us a footprint, which, you know, depending on the Turkish temperature at any given moment, we can operate out of eastern Syria. We can partner with the Kurdish SDF or not. And then, as I documented in my the first Syria episode, the Iraqis were like, hey, man, you cannot have a base. You know, after we were booted out of Syria and we set up camp in northern Iraq, they're like, you can't be here either. And so at that point, you're like, well, where do we go? You know, and so it's always been this sort of whack-a-mole or just moving, footprint situation there. And not to mention these days, it's even more precarious with what all the entropy that's happening now. So what happened with respect to our lay down in the wake of this skirmish?
I think it did a couple of things. One, it sort of certified that line of the Euphrates that the Russians just didn't venture over. So the Russians and Assad's forces couldn't make a power grab or a land grab, you know, because as the U.S. was effectively destroying ISIS, it was creating a vacuum there, and so Assad and his forces and his Russian allies couldn't slide into that vacuum. I think it just set that line. I think it also spoke to our partners, our Kurdish SDF partners, that we were there, that we backed them up. It showed a little bit of that resilience that I think is essential when you're fighting with indigenous forces, that you live up to your promise. And the QRF showing up, the SF guys showing up, the air coming when it came, I think just solidified that we had their backs. And I think you saw that after that, it was 2018, the line held. You didn't see really the Russians push across the Euphrates like that and take that line. And then you've got that northeast Syria kind of enclave where the Kurds and that they have that kind of fledgling democracy they're building up there. I think has something to be said around the idea that we held the line with them, when it was time.
So I'll put the link to Kevin's article at the War Horse in the episode description. So if you want to read more details about what went down here, check that out. So Kevin, it's always great to chat with you, and I hope our paths cross in real life before too long.
I hope so too. And congratulations on the new book coming out in May.
Thank you. As I said before, we're going to have you up here for the release party up here in Annapolis. So look for your invitation in the mail.
All right.
All right. That'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.